So it's my pleasure today to introduce Charlie Maurer. And it's to you, to an audience that may already know him pretty well, as Charlie has been a very active member of senior college for a number of years. Charlie is a freelance writer specializing in science and technology. He and Daphne write together, and they've written 2 books. The most recent one is called Pretty Ugly, Why We Like Some Songs, Faces, Foods, Plays, Pictures, Poems, etc., and dislike others. And you may recall that they spoke to us about this book. It was in May of 2020. It was probably our first attempt at trying Zoom online. An earlier book that the 2 of them wrote was called The World of the Newborn, and it explored perception in infants. It was awarded the book prize of the American Psychological Association. I gather that a 3rd collaboration is currently in the works. Charlie's solo writings are quite eclectic. They range from an article on English grammar to one on how to maximize the experience of reading on an iPad, which is very interesting. My personal favorite is called Sensible Fonts. So when we were developing the self-study for the Provostio Review, Janet Patterson and Daphne and I got into a discussion, of course, as you do, on what font to use. I mean, very important things. So Daphne sent me Charlie's piece, which really is a history of the various fonts, how they differ, and where they're best deployed. And it contains useful information such as this one, and I quote, "If you want to discourage people from reading something, use Helvetica/Arial," end quote. It's funny, it's informative, it's interesting, and it's worth checking out on his website. So Charlie has a background in graphic design and commercial photography. And having seen some of his images, I can testify to the quality of his work as a practitioner. However, he also writes about the technical aspects of the medium, most recently concentrating on digital photography. And today he is bringing his expertise in photography and photographic images. He's bringing that together with his knowledge of visual perception in his talk, which is entitled Illusion, Reality, Canvas, and Camera. Charlie?
Is this going to work? It's not. The slides aren't changing. Let's try. There's a technical term for this. It's in 4 letters. Let's see that. There we go. Now, all of us know that the realism in paintings can be phony. Yet all of us see photographs as realistic, but they're not. And paintings and photographs. Okay. Paintings and photographs are all illusions. They're all visual illusions, illusions that we need to learn to interpret. A Canadian anthropologist showed this in the 1960s. Edmund Carpenter visited a tribe in New Guinea. The tribe was so primitive that they still used stone axes. No one there had ever seen a photograph. Carpenter took people's pictures and showed them to them. Yeah. Okay. Not working?
Yes.
Okay, where am I?
Canadian anthropologist.
Right, okay.
You're right there.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so Carpenter described these pictures, these people. He reported, at first there was no understanding. The photographs were far removed from any reality they knew. They had to be taught to read them. I pointed to a nose in a picture, then touched the real nose, etc. Often one or more boys would intrude into the scene, peering intently from picture to subject, then shout, "It's you!" Recognition came gradually. Now, if photos were intrinsically realistic, those New Guineans would have read them instantly. They would not have needed to learn how to see them. But they did need to learn how to see them. That's because the appearance of reality in a photograph is as much an illusion as this cartoon is. Artists create comparable illusions in paintings. Artists create these illusions with lines and with splotches of color or gray, splotches of tonality. They learn to draw and they learn to paint. This duality is not an arbitrary convention. It derives from the ways that higher levels of the brain process visual images. Photographers create illusions with exactly the same elements. We'll look at tonality first. Later, we'll look at lines, and then we'll put the two together. Or rather, we'll see how the brain puts them together. Something that we need to keep in mind is that our eyes actually see nothing at all. Eyes are merely optical receptors, receptors that convert energy from light into neurochemical reactions. Those neurochemical reactions feed into the brain, and the brain integrates them. The brain's integrations are what we see. The brain doesn't deal with tones in the obvious way by registering how light or dark something is. Instead, the brain notices how different a tone is from the tones around it. The brain doesn't care about absolute levels of light. It cares about relative levels, about contrasts. When you look at a scene or at a picture, the brain picks out the lightest tones that contain any information and the darkest tones and uses those as reference points to define the brightness of everything else in the picture. The difference in their brightness defines the tonal range of the scene or the tonal range of the picture. For a photograph printed on paper like this one, the widest tonal range possible is about 100:1. Tonal ranges in the real world are much broader than that. This scene had no brilliant highlights or deep shadows, but it will still have had a tonal range of about 10,000:1. By the way, you're not looking at a basket case. The temperature was 40 degrees, yet the scowl was riding with a jacket and long trousers. Now, here we see a tonal range more typical of scenes that you probably like to photograph. It contains bright highlights and deep shadows, plus rock faces that are similar in brightness to human faces. It will have had a tonal range of about 100,000:1. This rainforest was so dark that after our eyes adapted to it, whenever we entered a clearing, we were blinded. Not counting the sun, the tonal range here would have been around 1,000,000:1. Now, these bars represent the range of brightness you may see in a real scene and the range of brightness, the range of tones possible in a photograph. I plotted them on a logarithmic scale because that's how the visual system deals with them. To the eye and to the brain, the difference from 1 to 10 is the same as the difference from 10 to 100 or from 100 to 1,000. Now, you can see from this that a photograph cannot possibly depict the full range of the tones that you may see in front of you. Here's how the tonal range in the scene is squeezed into the tonal range of a photograph. The extremes are lost. Less extreme ones are squashed together. That's why highlights in faces often turn pasty white and shadows become black. Only the middle tones have any chance of being reproduced accurately. On the other hand, scenes with a narrow range of brightness are narrowed even more to less than the full range of the paper. This is one reason snapshots taken on overcast days often come out looking dull. Compressing tones like this and lopping them off is manipulating the image. We're not aware that our photographs are being manipulated because the manipulations go on behind the scenes. With film, they're controlled by chemicals, and with digital cameras, they're controlled by computers programs, but they're still controlled. They're done automatically, the manipulations. The manipulations are not done by hand, but they're still manipulations. Manipulations following the instructions of engineers. Indirectly, engineers are manipulating the tones your camera is capturing so that one size fits all. Or rather, so that one size fits none. Moreover, even if tonal range could be displayed accurately, it would rarely look right. That's because a large area in nature is a small area on a photograph, and size affects the colors that we see. You'll all have experienced, if you've ever picked out a color of paint from a paint chip and then painted your room, it looks different once it's done. And here, it's hard to believe, but the background to this slide matches the fifth lightest of the 6 color chips the woman is looking at. I know it matches them because I copied the color from the chip onto the rest of the slide. Is that moving? No. Now, before we talk any more about color, we need to understand some basics of color vision. Really simple. Light enters the eye and bangs into some cone-shaped structures in the back of the eye. You can see them here. Now, for some inexplicable reason worthy of a philosophy department, worthy of a great investigation, no academic has called them anything unintelligible. They're called cones. These cones capture light and stimulate nerves. The light hitting these cones contains a mixture of wavelengths. Different cones are sensitive to different wavelengths. There are 3 kinds of cones, and each kind responds to a different set of wavelengths. The brain combines the cone's output in a number of ways, which we don't need to worry about, and creates the perception of color from them. Every color we perceive within a 3-dimensional space, a 3-dimensional perceptual space. That space we model like this. Hue, saturation, and brightness are 3 dimensions of this space. They are dimensions just as light, length, width, and breadth are dimensions in physical space around us. Now, hue is 1 dimension. It's a dimension that we describe not in inches, but in red, green, blue, and yellow. We may have a lot of colors, names for colors, but red, green, blue, and yellow are primary colors for the brain, not for mixing paints. They're the primary perceptual colors. If you give people color chips anywhere in the world and ask them to sort like with like, you'll end up with 4 piles: red, green, blue, and yellow, clustered something like this. Now, people will sort chips like this, even if their language has only 2 words for all colors: light and dark. Some people will put orange with yellow, some will put it in with red, but they will not create a pile of orange chips. They'll create piles of red, blue, green, and yellow. Second dimension, any color can be more or less pure. The more pure it is, the more saturated. The less pure, the closer it is to gray or to white, the less saturated. If a hue is completely desaturated, if it's completely gray, it can still be brighter or dimmer. This is brightness. Here's an example of this. Wait a minute. Oh, I got something got mixing. Wait a minute, what is this? I'm lost. Okay. Well, what this shows is that the colors depend upon their surroundings, their context, on the contrast with what's next to them. So in this case, the hue is the red hues and the orange hues are contrasting with the blues and the yellows, but they're actually the same color, rather the same pigment. Here we have another example. The colors are always influenced by the colors around them. When it comes to colors, to perceiving colors, we're always under the influence. Now, we never see anything on its own. We see everything against a background within a context. Experience has taught us to expect to see certain things in certain contexts. For example, experience has taught us to expect to see flowers in a context of foliage. Flowers are yellow, red, and blue. And foliage contrasts with yellow, red, and blue. So the brain slides foliage into the category green. And we see foliage as green. Now, here's a section of that photo. You see a lot of purple flowers. Purple is dark red, desaturated dark red. A very few red flowers and yellow flowers, and a massive green foliage. But the green of this foliage is an illusion. Let's look at the meadow in a computer program that will allow us to identify individual hues. On the right, I've set the program to identify every hue that's pure yellow. Pure yellow. Here I turn those yellows into magenta. As you recall, the picture shows few yellow flowers. Virtually all this magenta is foliage. Again, this is looking only for pure yellows, or rather for what would be pure yellows outside of any meaningful context. For what would be pure yellows if we were sorting color chips in the lab. But when people sort color chips, they also deem less pure yellows to be yellow. Here we're finding all of the yellows and turning all of the yellows into magenta. This shows how much of that green foliage you would deem to be yellow if you were matching colors in a lab. All of it. I might add that this is exactly what you would predict looking at graphs of the spectral sensitivity, of the spectral absorption of chlorophyll and the spectral sensitivity of the eye. Something similar happens whenever we see brown. The hue of brown is actually red, but we find it so useful to distinguish dark reds from bright reds that we learn to perceive dark reds as a different category. The hue of this brown shoe is actually, of that brown shoe, is actually this red. To make it brown, all I did was darken it by superimposing the gray shoe over top of it. Watch. Since colors and tones are so plastic, it ought to be clear that the idea of realistic tones and realistic colors is a chimera. Chasing accurate color is chasing the wind. Realistic colors are impossible because of differences in ranges of brightness, differences in area, and differences in context. Differs from one of us to another. The only possible goal of a photographer is not realism, it's verisimilitude, the appearance of realism, the illusion of realism, the illusion of accurate colors rather than accuracy itself. So far, all of this stuff has been theoretical. To see how it applies in practice, let's look at some frames of the world's first Technicolor movie. This dates from 1922. Now, the toll of the sea starts with the sea, and here it is. The sea's color is certainly not up to modern standards, and the girl's skin looks a mite pink, but it looks roughly naturalistic. Remember, this film was a century old, and you can see from all the scratches, and dust, and scars in the sky that the print of this film that the photo is made from had deteriorated. Here you can compare it to the norm today. On the right is a snapshot of the seaside that an English resort hotel publishes on its website. The modern colors are obviously purer, but if we connect the skies in both pictures, you can see that they're similar. And you can see that the ocean in both is recognizably an ocean. Yet, although this picture looks naturalistic, it has a surprising omission. It does not contain any blue. No blue whatsoever. The folks at Technicolor couldn't figure out how to make any shade of blue. They couldn't figure it out for another 10 years. There's no blue in this photograph, yet even the sea and the sky look acceptable, or they did until I pointed it out. Verisimilitude is an illusion, and the first goal of an illusionist is to create an appropriate context and expectation. The context demands blue, and we expect blue, so we see blue. Tonal illusions depend on expectation, and they also depend on contrast. That's why in this picture, square A looks darker than square B. Actually, they're the same shade. You can see this if we connect them with a bar that's the same shade as both. Excuse me. This illusion depends on both expectation and contrast. In the context of a checkerboard, we expect all the light squares to be the same color and all the dark squares to be the same color. We also expect the shadow not to change that. On top of this, the contrast is similar between every pair of adjacent squares. When the brain sees changes in contrast to be similar, it assumes that the tones forming the contrast are similar. This assumption applied to sound is why a singer can transpose the key of a song to suit her voice, yet nobody will notice. The brain can be fooled easily because the eye takes in clearly only tiny pieces of an image at once. A few degrees in the center of the field are sharp, and all the rest is blurry. The brain needs to assemble a lot of small pieces to see a whole, assemble them over time. In the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet psychologist named Alfred Jargus examined how people scan faces with their eyes. He found that the eyes jerk rapidly from one spot to another, then sit still for a half second or so, and suddenly jerk elsewhere. While they're jerking, nobody can, the eyes, the image blanks out altogether. The diagram on the right shows how one person scanned the picture on the left. While the eyes are moving, they see nothing. When they stop, all they see in focus is a tiny spot. The rest is a blur. Now, I've prepared a short simulation of this. Here's a train of donkeys that some nomadic shepherds are using to carry their wool to market and bring back supplies. Let's say you're standing where I was, and these donkeys are standing still. If you're watching that scene for 10 seconds, here is the information your eyes might pick up. That's something like what the eyes see and transmit to the brain. You know, for a half second, roughly plus or minus, a tiny spot containing a contrast surrounded by vague splotches of brightness, usually blurrier than that, then another spot for another half second, and on and on. This mechanism makes it difficult to compare things across space. That's why local bits of contrast matter, contrasts that are right next to each other. So we've seen that tones can contrast with nearby tones to build expectations about reality. Now let's look at artists, see how artists and photographers actually use tones to do this. First off, they make sure that adjacent tones vary naturally, even if they end up making distant contrasts ridiculous. This shows an example by Maurer from 350 years ago. The painting is about the size, it's 18 inches, it's a little smaller than the top of this podium. You know, a little bit this size. It hangs in a hallway in the Frick collection in New York City. You walk by it in the middle of the hall, it's a wide hall, you think, oh, somebody took the big painting away and put a photograph in its place. It's not, it's the painting, it's not, but it looks from a distance like a photograph. Even up close, it could almost be a photograph if it weren't for the rich colors and texture of its surface. Now, let's look at it more closely. It still looks realistic, but let's examine some highlights and shadows. Those on the woman's head are sharp, indicating a direct sun. These yellow lines show how the sun must be shining in from the top to cause the highlights and shadows on her face and her head and around her face and head. Those lines would intersect the front window at a most unlikely height for a home in 17th century Antwerp. Moreover, if I draw a fourth line, this one toward the back of her head, you can see that a sun up there would continue the highlight on her color, not cast a shadow onto her color. These are artificial highlights and artificial shadows. Nor could the sun up high be responsible for these highlights, and there is no place you could imagine a lamp outside the frame that would shine on these spots, but no place else. So this natural illumination is all invented. Here's another example, a woman illuminated by a candle. The adjacent tones vary naturally, so everything looks right. But the tonal relations overall are impossible. The molten wax at the top of the candle is no brighter than the highlights on her face, yet it's very, very much closer to the candle, to the flame, and the flame is supposed to be illuminating both. The candle ought to be brilliant, plain white, not the same tone. Movies are known for their realism, but in the case of lighting, that realism may begin and end with local contrasts. Distant contrasts are often nonsensical, as in this frame from The Thin Man. The highlights on these faces can't possibly come from the lamp because an opaque lampshade is in the way. The illumination from the table lamp ends there. The bulb in the lamp illuminates nothing more than the base of the lamp, the tabletop, and that part of the pillow. Movie scenes fly past too fast to analyze, but people scrutinize photographs closely over a long time. Even so, photographs can show comparable absurdities, yet still look natural if the local contrasts are sensible. Most of you will recognize this guy. It looks like a simple snapshot of Peter in a study. It's a snapshot taken by the light of his reading lamp. But look again, if the lamp were the source of light, then the lampshade would be white and its pleats would not cast shadows inside the shade. The shadowing inside the lampshade is impossible, yet it looks perfectly natural because we only notice the contrast of adjacent bits of the adjacent pleats. We don't, and all of those local contrasts make sense. By the way, if you ever look at one of my pictures tonight and wonder whether the lighting was natural or artificial, look for this light bulb in the lower right-hand corner. It will indicate that I controlled the light. And I suppose I ought to clarify that if anybody, since it's being recorded, that except for the slides showing movie stills, and all of the photographs in the presentation are mine. And are not to be reproduced without permission. Okay, in this case, I replaced the light bulb in the lamp with an electronic flash tube. I highlighted the far edges of Peter's face with a narrow spotlight that's out in the hallway. I illuminated the front of his face and body and his books with a tiny light box that you can see reflected in his eyes. And I filled in the shadow with a large light box. So it's hard to make a simple snapshot that you can enlarge to this size and have look good. It's also possible to create illusions of reality by creating artificial contrasts. Color has 3 dimensions, and the eye sees contrasts among all 3. At one level of the visual system, contrast is contrast is contrast. Doesn't matter what the dimension is. So if a painter or photographer is constrained by brightness, but still needs to show contrast, he can show contrast in hue or saturation, and we won't notice the difference. Here the panel labeled hue shows all the hues in this portrait at maximum saturation. The panel labeled saturation shows all the different levels of saturation in this portrait, converted so that white is 0 and black is 100%. The brightness shows the brightness dimensions by itself. You can pull, just mix and match, and things will look natural, as you'll see. Now, that kind of artificial contrast is a standard device in Hollywood. This scene creates the illusion of a sunny day. Of course, a real scene in brilliant sun like that would be 2 too contrasted to record on film. So it's obvious the lighting is artificial. Has to be. Since the range of brightness they had available to play with on skin was limited, they made some artificial contrasts of color using makeup. And let's look at this a little larger. The woman obviously has red makeup on the side of her cheeks, which is standard glamour stuff. And they spread the guy's face with mottled red to make his skin look more weather-beaten. Here are the hues at maximum saturation so that you can see them. And to see what this looks like without the Hollywood treatment, looks perfectly natural. Looks more natural than the one in the middle in the context. Now, artificial contrasts aren't just Hollywood treatments. They can enhance ordinary photographs too. Now, I wanted this portrait to be as realistic as possible. Nothing you see in the picture is contrived, except that he combed his hair. All I did to the cabinet maker's workshop was to rearrange the wood on the tables and remove a few tools that were hanging on the cabinet behind his head. I didn't even ask him to comb his hair, but he did. And it looks less natural as a result. But except for that, it looks as much like the guy as any portrait can look like anybody. But consider for a moment how much stuff is in this photograph and how far away the subject is. He's tiny. His face is tiny. You'd normally expect a face so small away, surrounded by so much stuff, to be lost inside the picture. And instead, he stands apart within a space of his own. And to help create that space, I painted it, just that space, with a subtle red light. You can see the red cast of that light by comparing these ends of the piece of wood. The farther one is redder than the rest of the plywood. The cabinet maker, the plywood behind the man's head is also redder than the rest of the plywood. The cabinet maker himself is illuminated by that reddish light. The subtle tint of red helps to make him and his end of the workbench stand out from everything else in the room. It also helps make his face three-dimensional. This is an enormous blow-up of a tiny area. A blow-up this large creates the flat perspective that you see in a really long telephoto lens, some of the other side of a sports arena. Yet his face doesn't look flat, it looks modeled. And one reason is a range of tones, a range of hues across his skin. His face is modeled with variations in color, brought out partially by that light. Here you can see the hues fully saturated. They don't vary as much as the generals in the film, but they're varying the same kind of way. At the original saturation, the different hues look perfectly natural. We expect to see contrasts in a face, and we simply do not notice whether a subtle contrast comes from hue, from saturation, or from brightness. Artificial contrasts can make landscapes more natural as well. This looks very realistic. It has a lot of depth, and you can see individual trees covering the mountain, which is what I saw. But the camera recorded this. Less depth, a mass of green on the mountain, no individual trees. You can see the comparison. There's no question which is realistic. I saw a forest of individual trees, not a mass of dull green. And the bush in the foreground was literally in my face. To create this verisimilitude, I needed to alter local contrasts. I couldn't change the levels of brightness much before the foliage began to look unnatural. Instead, I increased the range of saturation, and I made some of the darker tones of the distant forest red as well as darker. Now, there's supposed to be, did I include that? No, I didn't. Right, okay. Yes, have you seen this? I did click that, okay. Now, naturalistic painters deal wholesale in arbitrary contrasts. When they need to convey detail in shadows, they often create artificial colors. Now, this is a very large painting of an operating theater with the patient cut open on the table. It's 8 feet high, and in the front, it's life size. You see this guy's guts. I suggest that if you ever go look at it at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, you do it before lunch, not after. Now, let's look closely at the background. This is just artificial colors. Background doesn't look like that in lecture hall. A similar technique can make photographs look more real. This is a realistic sunset in the Yukon, realistic looking. Everything in the photo is sharp from the grasses in front to the peak, and the colors are just that dramatic. But let's enlarge some of the darker colors. You can see these are arbitrary contrasts that are comparable to those of the painting we saw. Not only can arbitrary contrasts look natural, the supposedly real contrasts recorded from a camera are often ludicrously unnatural. For example, here is a picture that my camera recorded. It is obvious if you'd been there, you would have seen something quite different. The white disk is the sun. The sun illuminates things. You would have seen the mountains. You would have seen everything, the trees, not black. But that's the natural range of light as produced by the photographic engineers. All of these contrasts are artificial, but they capture the appearance of reality. This is an extreme example, but the basic principle holds everywhere. Cameras themselves do not capture reality and cannot capture reality. The best photograph can do is capture an illusion of reality, and that requires manufacturing unrealistic contrasts. But note that this does not mean colors need to be saturated, that the pictures need colors. At 18,000 feet during the monsoon, you don't see a lot of color. Now, if all this sounds as though colors are arbitrary, well, to a remarkably large extent, they are. The technical folks made color films for 10 years without showing a hint of blue. That's arbitrary. To make colors look natural, all you need is an appropriate context and expectation. For example, I think you'll agree that these Chinese children look natural. I balance their colors to blend in with their surroundings. These Turkish children also look natural. But I balance their colors to stand out from their surroundings. The flesh tones of the two pictures are very different, and I'm sure that neither of them is accurate, but it doesn't matter. Although accurate color is a chimera, lifelike color is not. Now, I began this talk by pointing out that the illusion of reality comes from tones and also from lines. Now let's move from tones to lines. Let's see what kinds of line are important for illusion and what kinds of line don't matter. Excuse me. Let's begin with an experiment. Here's a picture of a spider. I'm going to show you two variants of this, neither as good as the original. Now, which of these variants looks more like the spider? If you were the spider's mother, which one would you want to keep in your wallet? Now, most people would say the one on the right. It's the better likeness overall. On the web, you can make out the strands of on the left, you can make out the strands of the web more clearly, but the right shows a clearer image of the spider itself, and it captures better the sunlight on the web. To make the version on the left, I kept all of the picture's pixels, but I blurred each picture over 15 others. Full information, lots of noise. For the picture on the right, I deleted 15 pixels of every 16 and interpolated the empty spaces using interpolation. How's that for the Department of Redundancy Department? So this is less information. No noise, but less information. Equal proportions. 94% noise, 94% smear. The right-hand picture has more contrast, less information, but more contrast. The eye sees contrast, so that's the one you care about. That's the one you want to keep in your wallet. It's possible to paint lines so thin that they can hardly be seen without a loop. We have a Turkish miniature at home in that state. You have to see it with a loop, or else you can't see it. But I'm sorry. Okay, but there's no need to paint lines that fine. This is a portrait of a wealthy furrier by Rembrandt. Painted when Rembrandt was a 25-year-old who wanted to make his mark. In this painting, his goal was to provide details that jump off the page and scream at people. This man is rich, and this artist is a genius. It's close to life size. And when you look at the original in the Frick Museum in New York, it's hard to believe that the man isn't standing in front of you. If you're far away, you want to go up and say hello. But if you go up close, you see the brushstrokes and you see resolution that is not exactly natural. This is how Rembrandt painted the face in rough. Again, the original is life-sized. Although the resolution is coarse, the coarse lines have clear contrasts. Clear contrasts are creating the illusion of fine detail. We expect them to be there because we know what roughs look like, and well, looks like a rough. With photographs, as with Rembrandt, when people see hairs and other details that they think is fine, then they're impressed by the fineness of the detail, no matter how coarse it actually is. And in reality, whenever people see detail as clearly as we see the hairs of this man's beard, they're almost always seeing coarse detail that contrasts clearly with the background. This is the Taoist priest. Compare him with this photograph this one young woman that I photographed in the 19th century. Unfortunately, my time machine wasn't working quite right. It didn't capture her cap. The finest lines in this picture are half as thick as the other. If you're close enough, you can see individual hairs blowing across the woman's face. The man's beard is obviously coarser, yet the man's beard looks sharper than the woman's hair because in the original size, because it has greater contrast. We don't notice an absence of fine detail because, as we saw before, most of what the eye sees is blurry. We see only a small, sharp spot at any one time. Our peripheral vision guides the eye to look at different spots, but peripheral vision is blurred. Because our peripheral vision is blurry, it guides the eye only to contrasts that are easy to see. So we notice something fine only when it's close by something that our perceptual vision is coarse enough to take us to. When our peripheral vision is coarse enough to take us to. No one ever accused me of articulating. We're not mixing up words. Okay, since the eye and the brain don't see much fine detail, perceptions are normally impressionistic. Since perceptions are impressionistic, little detail is necessary to make a picture look real. If you look at Rembrandt's later portraits, you'll see that he learned to create a stunning degree of verisimilitude with no fine detail at all. This portrait is life-sized. When you look at it on the wall at the Met in New York, Rembrandt could be there next in the room, could be, and sitting there in the frame. It's difficult to look at this painting and see how little detail it contains. Remember, the original is nowhere near this large. It's only life size. Well, let's enlarge it even more. The painting is stunningly realistic. It's hardly a single element that in it that's finely drawn or literal. Not a single brushstroke is finely drawn. Mind you, coarsely drawn does not mean carelessly drawn. X-rays show that when Rembrandt painted something impressionistically with blobs of color, he often repainted those blobs many times before he was satisfied. Of course, to interpret lines, it isn't sufficient that they be contrasty. We also need experience. The lines here are very sharp and clear, but they form a pattern so far from our usual experience that at first blush they aren't intelligible, like the New Guinean's first photographs. This is foliage reflected in a lake. Mirror Lake is its name for some reason. Experience and expectation as they apply to lines are the last subject we'll cover. Let's begin in Thailand with a nice woman selling food in a market. You can tell how nice she is from her smile and her posture. She's obviously friendly and forthcoming. Yet look at the grill behind her. Those are vertical bars. Compare her posture to one of those bars. She's sitting bolt upright. She is actually friendly and forthcoming, but to give you that perspective on her personality visually, I distorted the lines of the picture. Experience and expectation applied to lines form perspective, or most kinds of perspective. When a baby begins to reach for things, when a baby begins to reach for things, he begins to perceive that objects feel and look different as he moves them around. When he starts to run around outside, he hears something comparable. Even a child who's born blind will reach for things and hear things. So even someone who was born blind will understand that objects present different sizes and faces when approached from different places. A blind man can draw these changes using raised lines. Here you see 4 drawings of a solid cube and 4 drawings of a wire cube by Ezram, a blind fellow John Kennedy studied in Turkey. They show clearly that Ezram perceived objects with different perspectives, but none of them looks accurate. Now, of course, Ezram was blind and needed to feel his drawing rather than see it. But most of us, I mean, a kid would draw perspectives the same, cues the same way. We did when we were young. Most of us still do now. And even if you have studied drawing, you still cannot draw them more accurately in 2 dimensions. You are fooling yourself if you think you can. That's because you sense this cube in the real world in 4 dimensions, but you're drawing it on 2 dimensions. There is no way, there is no accurate way to reproduce 4 dimensions onto 2 dimensions. Simply can't be done. Now, in the 5th century BC, a couple of Greeks, Democritus and Anaxagoras, I forget what they did in life, worked out one unnatural way to convert 3 dimensions into 2 by using converging lines. Now, an architect named Vitruvius described it much later. By this deception, a faithful representation of the appearance of buildings might be given in painted scenery, so that though all is drawn on a vertical flat facade, some parts may seem to be withdrawing into the background, and others seem to be standing out in front. He wrote that in the 1st century BC, and you can see wall paintings in Pompeii that use this kind of perspective. It's what we call geometrical perspective, linear perspective, optical perspective, or artist's perspective. Take your pick. And it's a useful kind of a perspective for making drawings and paintings. But it's hard to imagine it as intrinsically convincing, since it was said most Greeks and most of the Mediterranean descendants ignored it. They knew about it, but they ignored it for 2,000 years, most of them. This is not intrinsically necessary to bring things to intrinsic perspective. Okay. And one reason is that this perspective actually falsifies 3-dimensional appearances. For example, here's a photograph of an Ottoman mosque that obeys all of the laws of linear perspective. In this picture, all of the parallel lines are converging exactly as the geometers say they ought to. Now, but if this picture is realistic, then the building must be falling down. If you were ever in a building and saw walls like this, you would run for the door. A less pure form of linear perspective permits parallel lines to converge in only one direction and keeps them parallel in the other. Here the horizontal lines are parallel and the upright lines converge. But what building, this is building as though it's keeling over from sunstroke. You know, buildings don't keel over backwards. It's been around, the temple has been around in the sun for long enough to become a ruin, but it's still standing upright and plumb. So let's try it the other way. Here the vertical lines are vertical. They're parallel, at least by local standards of construction. But the horizontal lines converge toward the left. Finally, we have a building that is not falling down. This looks more realistic, but what can possibly be accurate about a representation that shrinks a building in one direction and not the other? So let's try straightening all of the parallel lines so that all of them stay parallel. This often looks the most natural, but it bears no relationship to optics whatsoever. Think about it. The left side of this house is farther from us than the center. If parallel lines converge as they become more distant, then the beams forming this house ought to be converging toward the left. But then they should also be converging toward the right. And they should be converging toward the top which is farther away, and toward the bottom, which is farther away. So you should have 4 convergences. If you, in something like this. And in fact, if your eye were a camera, it would actually record parallel lines in converging in every direction. This fisheye perspective. This is the perspective that approaches the image that is cast inside the eye when you stare at something. Most of the image at any one time in the eye is blurry, but this is the perspective of the image of the eye. The eye does not transmit straight lines to the brain. The brain abstracts straightness and parallelism. It abstracts straightness and parallelism. Since the brain abstracts straightness and parallelism, other neuronal traffic in the brain affects our perception of them. Our perception of straightness and parallelism is affected by context, much as color is. You can see that in these 2 illusions. On the left, the lines don't look straight, and on the right, they don't look parallel. But watch them. When we walk around the world, our perspective on it shifts. Distant objects always look smaller. Distant objects continually change, and context distorts optical relationships. No form of geometrical perspective is complete because geometrical perspective cannot take any account of context. For example, if you stand on a height of land surrounded by a vast plain, the horizon appears not to be straight, but to be curved. You're actually too low to detect the curvature of the Earth. You need to be in an airplane for that. But within the context, your brain does not abstract a straight horizon. There's nothing else straight in the picture. And the fisheye image, the blurry fisheye image creates curvy lines, so you see a curvy line. So in this photograph, to give a naturalistic, impressionistic vastness, I had to incurve the horizon artificially. In fact, I used a fisheye lens to capture 180 degrees, and then I flattened the horizon. Of course, a Byzantine painter would have known that linear perspective is not realistic. If I can imagine, someone in a meeting like this saying at the Q&A, reality is not of this world. Reality is an eidos, an idea. God is greater than an angel. An angel is greater than the king, and the king is greater than the commoner. That is ultimately real. So that is how we expect things to be depicted. Greater things must be greater, and lesser things must be lesser. Now, that's the painting of this, that's the perspective of this painting of the Madonna and Child with a couple of saints. And my impression is, I've not studied it, my impression is that across time and cultures, that's the most common form of perspective. But even without theology, people have thought this to be a natural perspective. Here's an portrait of a 22-year-old functionary of the East India Company with one of his servants. It's about the size of a business card. It tells you something about the society. But the Chinese man of letters would have made a different argument. The perspective capturing most of reality is the perspective that shows the most about a scene, obviously. This is what anyone would expect. To paint the most realistic picture of a house, I need to show as much of the house as possible. This is natural perspective. Now, this scroll is called Entertainments of a House of Pleasure. It's the perceptual equivalent of a novel written in the omniscient point of view. It shows everything. Here's a section blown up. Everything going on at once. Lift parts of houses, you lift ceilings, you lift roofs. You want to see as much as you can see. Now, by any optical standard, this perspective is bizarre, but it does show a lot happening at once. And this perspective was not used by a trivial number of people over a trivial length of time. It was common in China for millennia. On the other hand, another learned gentleman from ancient China or Japan might have argued that all of those perspectives are nonsensical. The Byzantine perspective is based on a barbarian philosophy, and the other perspectives ignore the nature of the eye. Scenes have a foreground and a middle ground and a background, but the eye will focus on only one of these at a time. On the other hand, we do expect to be able to look at each of these three planes. For this reason, a natural perspective displays three independent planes. This happens to be a contemporary painting, but the tradition of this painting is very old and very common. Clearly, the perspective we deem to be realistic is formed by our cultural experience, not by optics or by geometry. Nowadays, we imbibe linear perspective from infancy, and we're far removed from other cultures, so we expect to see some form of linear perspective, and the other notions sound quaint. They sound the when they're described. However, we saw that linear perspective is hardly a be-all and an end-all. And if you actually see those quaint-sounding perspectives, you have enough experience with them to understand them. Here, I'll show you some examples. Here we have perspective showing importance by size. This picture shows hardly any depth. It's almost as flat as a primitive painting, yet it looks perfectly natural. And if I ask you which man is the most important, I suspect you'll say it's the big guy on the right. This portrait of a young doctor looks perfectly natural, yet the linear perspective is as bizarre as he is. I'm sorry, no, I said that backwards. He is bizarre, but that's another story. Mary, you don't tell that to your brother. It's as bizarre as the Chinese House of Entertainment, as in the picture of the House of Entertainment. Everything can be seen all at once, including both sides of the doctor's head and the room behind us. Other cues to depth are also bizarre. On the one hand, the head behind is sharp, but the head in front is blurry. And the arm behind is blurry, and the arm in front is sharp. Now, this portrait of a sculptor in a studio shows the same omniscient perspective, but with even greater complexity. Again, this contains no hints of linear perspective, yet the space and our interpretation seem natural. And finally, this picture of the Himalaya has no linear perspective at all, but it has a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, independent, and they're clear. For scale, notice the horses in the lower front, in the lower left corner. I had a Japanese scroll painting in mind when I took this photo, but it doesn't take a Japanese brain to understand it. Nor does it take a vertical frame. This kind of perspective is not so arbitrary as it sounds. If we see a foreground and a background, then we expect to see depth. And if we also see a plane in the middle, that provides additional information that confirms our expectations and reinforces the illusion. Again, with the foreground and a background, we see two distinct planes. But adding one or two intermediate planes provides more information about the picture's depth. Here, again, there are no straight lines to provide linear perspective. If we were camped here, I should tell you that it was difficult having to wake up to this view, but we toughed it out. With the two pictures side by side, the difference in the feeling of depth is obvious. Both of them are basically bitonal. The top one uses only gray and green. The bottom one uses only blue and red, and neither contains any form of perspective save those of planes. In the photo above with two planes, you would need to fly to reach the mountains. But in the photo below, you can walk from here to there. William Hogarth wrote, "Whoever makes a design without the knowledge of perspective is liable to such absurdities as this." However, accurate perspective is not the linear perspective of academic art. It is merely the filling of an expectation. The question now is this: what do we expect naturally? What is it that makes objects and spaces in a flat picture look solid, three-dimensional, and real? One indicator is relative size. A bird is not as big as a tree. This picture has virtually no cues to depth except relative size, but that works. We know and perceive men to be larger than goats. So when we see some goats that are larger than a man, we see them to be closer. The second indicator of depth is overlapping elements. Here, timbers block our view of the carpenter, so they look closer. But one thing you probably will not recognize in this picture is this stick. That is a machete hanging from his belt. The man is building a house. 6 men are building a house equipped with nothing but machetes and this saw. That's in the Chinese countryside. Key information also comes from highlights and shadows. Those are what permit us to figure out what this photo. It looks like an avant-garde graphic at first, but then you notice highlights and shadows. They let you work out that it's a corner of a complex corner of a building, not a straight conventional corner, with blue walls that are turned pink by sunset, and the continuous runs of windows. Once you realize that they're windows, the highlights and shadows reflected in the windows, but you see a conventional building in the reflection, even though it's distorted. A special case of highlights and shadows we can see here in this portrait of a doctor. That's the highlight in the middle of his face. That highlight makes the front of his face look closer to us than the sides. You can see this even with nothing else visible, with no other cues to depth. You can see it even with it in a circle, with just a blurry light in the middle, blurry spotlight in the middle. All of these ways of figuring out depth, babies begin to learn in the first year of life, once they start reaching for objects. Finally, the one form of depth dealing with tones is aerial perspective. When you're outdoors, distant colors dull, dust and water droplets in the atmosphere scatter light, blurs all the bits of light reflected with one another. The colors get mixed up, tones merge, and colors become less pure and less saturated like this. That's the only one that's not learned as a baby. At least not in the West. It might be learned in the Himalaya. I don't know. So in summary, color and artistic perspective are not optical realities. They're perceptions of the brain, perceptions bound up with what we've learned to expect. They're created not through the application of geometry or optics, but through sleight of hand. It's the case with paintings, the case with photographs. The more realistic a picture looks, the greater the illusion. On the other hand, this cartoon is realistic. It summarizes accurately what you see when looking at a painting or a photograph. The contrast is the root of all we see. After all, if a reflection blends into the background, we can't see it. Contrasts stimulate two mechanisms within the brain: the mechanism for seeing lines and the mechanism for seeing tones. To interpret those lines and tones, we apply our experience and expectations. Now, to see all this in one example, let's look at a photo of a window in Newfoundland, and see how they all fit together. This picture shows a lot of contrast, so we see it clearly. Broad areas of red run around the perimeter and contrast with areas of white and black in the dark background. Those tones are bounded by clear edges. Each clear edge forms a line. But expectation is more complicated. The combination of lines and tones resembles things we've seen, I should say, expectation in this picture is more complicated. The combination of lines and tones resemble things we've seen before, which we call windows. So we expect this to be a window. If it's a photograph, we expect it to be a realistic picture of a window. If I tell you that it's a fish house in a Newfoundland outport, then you might expect it to be connected to boats. So you might perceive that the indistinct smudges in the middle reflect boats. But this window is not shaped like any window you would expect to see. You'll never have seen a window frame with an angle like that. If you look carefully, you'll also see that every line in the photograph is bizarre. It actually shows 3 different points of view at once. These lines of the window converge toward the left, which implies we're seeing it from the right. Yet we're looking at the left-hand edge of this post, so we must be seeing it from the we must be seeing it from the left. On top of that, we're looking down at all of the horizontal parts, yet the frame is not converging downward. How can we be looking at this in 3 perspectives at once, from 3 directions at once in a photograph? Now, if you know Newfoundland only from stereotypes and jokes, you might think this is an architectural equivalent of a Newfoundland's horse. In this case, you'd see the picture as surreal rather than real. But if you've spent much time on the island, then you might see it otherwise. You would know that the economy and society are so distorted that a village might have virtually no residents of childbearing age. A school bus might pick up only 1 child. Might. Maybe 2, maybe none. If you know Newfoundland, you expect the fresh red paint to have been applied for the tourists, and you expect the peeling white paint shows reality. If you know the reality of Newfoundland, you might see this window as symbolic, as a distorted image illustrating a distorted socioeconomic mess. So In summary, color and artistic perspective are not optical realities. The perceptions of the brain, perceptions bound up with what they've learned to expect. They're created not through the application of geometry or through optics or through sleight of hand, no matter whether paintings or photographs, the same thing. Indeed, I'd argue that this painting by Magritte is more realistic than any photograph ever taken. Because unlike any other image, it represents itself accurately. As it states, this is not a pipe. It's merely an image of a pipe. And the appearance of reality from an image is an illusion created in the head. So that's it. Finally, I'll end with a shameless plug. I pulled much of this talk and some of its examples from Pretty Ugly. It's almost as effective a soporific as I am in person. I know that some people were quite enjoying their evening snooze, as I always do when I'm in the audience. And anyway, if you need help sleeping, I recommend it. We have here 3 copies with us that we can sell you at our cost, which was $39. If you're not in the room, Pretty 20 is a discount code that will get you 20% off from the publisher. You can see the outline and sample chapters at the URL. Anyway, thanks for putting up with me, and I'm looking forward to talking with you guys with the Q&A.